Exotic leather is a general term that refers to mostly any kind of processed hide that has been turned into leather that is not very common. So for example, very common leathers include, bovine, cowhide, pig, goat, sheep, things like that. They're widely available and in high volumes. Other leathers are going to be much lower volume in production and maybe a little trickier to get. And it's all leather, though these are typically referred to as exotic leathers because they're not going to be readily available or most commonly used. So it's mostly a general term. And some examples of exotic leathers are going to include, crocodile, snakeskin, fish, kangaroo, any kind of lizards, snakes, peccary, ostrich, all kinds of things like that. And that list can go on and on and on. Because when you think about it, most hides aren't, the 4 or 5 most popular. However, when we refer to, leather, it's usually going to be among those 4 or 5 most popular hide types. So exotic leather can be a huge amount of things, and it's a general term that references those. Let's take a brief look at the history of exotic leathers. And just like most things, it has evolved throughout time, showcasing the craftsmanship and the societal needs of different cultures and people and environments that they lived. Some exotic leather, like those from reptiles and aquatic animals, dates back thousands of years BCE, when they were used for clothing and bags and shoes, belts, armor, and other items used in day-to-day life. Crocodile and snake skins were prized for their unique textures and patterns. And the demands for different types of exotic leathers actually changes over time. During the Middle Ages, European royalty and nobility started looking for more varied leathers to almost showcase their differentiation from the other classes. And these include, hides like caimans, iguanas, and ostriches, pretty much through the 15th through 17th centuries. Advances in tanning and transportation during the Industrial Revolution really impacted the production of the exotic leather hides in the 19th century, making them more accessible to a much wider market and also an increased variety of hide types to those markets as well. So luxury brands like Hermes, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, and Prada began using exotic hides for high-end accessories. These included things like handbags and shoes and belts, and crocodile, alligator, snake, and lizard hides were really among the most sought after in the mid to late 1900s. However, with this increase in demand, we often see an increased impact, on those hide populations. So most recently, there's been a prioritization more over, ethical sourcing of these hides and also protection of those environments as well. So with that balance, the use of exotic leather reflects both the preferences and needs of more modern times. And so you could see it used now in some select leather goods that require that type of material to really make them stand out. All right, let's take a really close-up look at an exotic leather hide so you could see what it looks like zoomed in. Here we've got the top of an exotic leather. Now in most leather types, you're going to see a relatively consistent grain pattern, and that may vary based on the hide or, the characteristics of it. Here we see a really unique texture to it. It's almost like a scaly, nodule-covered surface, and very different than your common, vegetable tan bovine leather or something like that. So as we get into the exotics, the differentiation and the variation between the hide types is going to be huge. Like this may have, an appearance like this, others may have scales. It really begins to vary widely when you get into exotics. Checking out the bottom, here's the exotic hide. You can see a grain pattern in here, but even this is going to be a little different than a bovine leather. We see the open fibers in the bottom, and you can see how they're, going to feel a little fuzzy to the touch. But even then, there's a unique pattern to it, kind of how they're, meshed together. Even there's a different coloration too in this hide. For example, a typical, vegetable tan leather, even a chrome tan, would have a mostly consistent coloring to the bottom, but this even has some variations in that after tanning. And here you go. Looking at the section view of an exotic leather, you could see stark differences in the composition of these layering structures in the fibers. A typical vegetable tan leather piece of, cowhide leather is going to, basically have consistent layers that go from tight and dense to more open towards the bottom. Here we see somewhat of a similar pattern of that. The top does have like a tight, dense surface area to it, and the bottom does open up. yet we could see clearly some other elements that are lighter colors periodically throughout the layers. So the structure is going to be different. That's going to vary based on the type of exotic hide that it is, but it's really cool to see one example of like how different just one can be compared to the most common leathers that we're familiar with. When looking at the production process, the exotic leather tanning can vary fairly largely based on the type of hide that it is. Some are going to require unique steps, like a beaver tail leather is going to be different than a python leather, maybe different than a crocodile. So broadly speaking, it's going to follow, most often a chrome tanning process, sometimes a vegetable tanning process, and then how it's finished is going to be different based on the hide and the characteristics of it. Some are going to be, fully dried and a protective coating added. Some are going to have, colorants or dyes or textures applied to it. Others are just going to have protective finishes that will help, seal in the more delicate nature of some of the hides, still allowing them to be durable and usable. So just as much as there's variation in types of hides, there's going to be some nuances to the finishing steps of exotic leathers. The cost for exotic leathers. So we mentioned the variability in how many different types there are, and guess what? The cost is going to vary as well. So instead of going by square foot, which is more common for, popular leathers such as bovine leather and all the different tanning varieties, here, let's give us some broad examples around different types and then the cost for them. So for example, we could look at a crocodile leather. Full hide, depending on the grade and the size, can range from around $250 to around $1,500. Something like a quality snakeskin can be around $100 per meter. Looking at a fish skin, it can be around $15 to $40 per hide. And again, there's a large variation in terms of size of fish, just like there is in snakeskin. Looking at kangaroo, that's going to be a little more standard, around $10 to $15 per square foot. You're often going to find that sold in full hides and occasionally on half hides. Lizard leather, around $90 per hide. Again, a lot of variability in what, type of hide and how large it is. Looking at ostrich, a full hide can usually sell for around $200 to $600, depending on the size and grade. And then looking at something like a peccary leather, that could be around $20 to $40 per square foot. And so just as a few examples here, you can see there's a huge amount of different types, even how you could buy them, by the hide, the half hide, square foot, things like that. And so the broadest range, I'd say probably around, $10 to $1,500 for exotic leathers. And you could certainly go above that, you could certainly go below that. And the variables beyond the type are going to include, the quality of the hide, the tanning process that was used, and the quality of the tannery that produced it. The pros. Some of the most clear ones are going to be the unique looks. Often, exotic leathers have very exotic looks, and that's going to be usually instantly recognizable from a visual perspective, from an aesthetic look, and often from a tactile feel. And so that's by and far the biggest pro. Another is that they're usually very durable. Given that they had a functional purpose when used for leather working as well, that functional, properties and characteristics can carry on through the leather good. So having a nice durable leather is definitely a pro. One of the biggest cons are that they are usually more expensive. Given that they are exotic, less available, and sometimes require a more complex tanning process, there could definitely be increased prices, for all different types of exotic leathers. Another is that they can be really tricky to find, depending on what you are looking to get. There's regional differences, time of year differences, so it can be trickier to track down a specific type of exotic leather. Let's take a look at a few good uses. Broadly speaking, and then we'll kind of go into some narrow examples, but we've got wallets, shoes, boots and handbags, definitely belts, watch straps, gloves, sheaths and jewelry, even using some for things like lampshades, small purses, and cases and things like that. Yet another option is as an inlay. Since they have a unique look, you can often inlay exotic leathers along with other leathers and projects and make a really nice visual contrast. So a few popular examples, crocodile shoes, they're pretty well known. Exotic leather purses, exotic leather watch straps, like an ostrich purse, snakeskin belts, all kinds of things like that. So it's pretty much your imagination could lead you to create, whatever combination you like. And those are some really popular examples. A few tips. When working with exotic leather, the first thing to think about is your sourcing. So since it can be tricky to get some, if you're going to be making a one-off piece, cool, you probably have enough material, when you start. If you're going to be making, a series of items, make sure you have enough material before you start, and that way you don't get midway through a production run or something and then not be able to source a similar tannage. Because even materials from the same tannery, tanned at different times, can have some variable differences in look and feel. So just one thing, think ahead, make sure you've got enough material. Now the second would be try to either make or use some scrap and test out how your tools will respond to it. Because depending on the type of leather that you're working with, it may be different. Like for example, if you have stingray leather, that's a very tough nodule covered surface. And so if you're using any kind of like a stitching irons, or if you're putting holes in or hand stitching, it's going to work very differently than if you're just using regular vegetable tan, especially if you're cutting as well. For example, if you're cutting a crocodile hide, there are nodules on the top, and that may make the knife jump. So you want to make sure you've got that accounted for in your technique. So when you're working on the actual material that's going to be used in your finished good, you're familiar with it, your work's going to be clean, and the output's going to be nice and highly, fit and finish are going to be high, and it's going to look very well done. So there you have it, a look into the world of exotic leathers. There are so many out there, and chances are, as you get exposed to different ones, you may have a preference for one material over another, maybe the way it looks, maybe the way it feels, and likely be able to use it in a project that you like that comes out really, really great.